Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm so glad to be here today with Toby Passman, who has invented Neuroflex, which provides neural feedback, biofeedback that helps people get the information they need to retrain their brain. Hi, Toby.
Hi, Loretta. It's so nice to be here. It's been a long time since you came on my podcast a while ago, so I'm super excited to be chatting with you again.
Me too. So tell us what Neuroflex does.
Yeah, so Neuroflex is basically a brain optimization company. So we actually evaluate the brain with what's called a brain map. So this is a type of brain scan that actually measures the biological rhythms going on in the brain called brain waves. So this is the
Let me
electric.
just first interrupt. Say, this is something that a person just does at home on their couch, right?
They can, yeah. So there is the remote way to do it where I ship people equipment and they can do it all now through an app due to advancements in the technology. People can also go into a clinic in which they would get the full swim cap looking device put on their head and their brain waves would be measured. So there's
And
different
are these
ways.
clinics everywhere or they have to go to a certain location?
Major metropolitan areas usually have a couple neurofeedback clinics. Kind of more rural areas, they might not have one. I would say it's not quite, a mainstream thing yet. Probably a lot of listeners have never heard about these technologies before. So it is something people do sometimes have to do a bit of digging for, which is really why I kind of created a virtual option so now people, regardless of where they're at in the country or even, in other countries in the world, are able to still access this technology.
Okay, great. So what does a person do once they access it?
Yes. So basically the brain scan, the brain map allows them or allows us to actually evaluate how their brain is functioning on a biological level. So we evaluate the five major brain waves. So people may or may not have heard of these, but delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. So these are all frequencies that our brain generates that really produce all these different aspects of our cognition and consciousness. So, for instance, like delta waves are really produced mainly in deep restorative sleep. Theta is more light sleep, drowsiness, and attention. Alpha is kind of a calm, relaxed, idling rhythm of the brain. Beta is more of that sharp, focused, alert state. And then gamma is like a peak state of extreme focus, flow, interconnectedness. So, we basically are able to assess to see is someone producing healthy amounts of these different brain waves, or is there either a deficiency or overactivity, meaning a certain area of their brain is dysregulated. So, based on that data that we collect, we can kind of pair that together with people's subjective experiences and understand, if someone is struggling with racing thoughts and worry and insomnia and anxiety and all these things. And then we see that a specific area of the brain, maybe we see that the temporal lobes right above the ears, if we see that the temporal lobes are super, super overactivated, then we kind of have been able to match what's going on in their brain to what they're experiencing. But most importantly, we can then leverage that data to actually retrain their brain to have healthier patterns.
So do you measure a person while they're doing an activity? And like for how long do you measure?
Great question. Yeah. So basically during the scan, it's really just to get a baseline. So there's eyes open recordings, eyes closed recordings. Then I also have someone do like a mental performance task in which they're counting backwards, by like sevens from a specific number. So it is kind of assessing the brain at rest with your eyes open, with your eyes closed, and then also kind of a concentration examination. So this is something that I think, tell me again the second part of your question there.
Well, how long? Like
How
when you're
long?
looking at sleep, do you do it through the night while they're asleep or what?
Yes, good question. So, no, we do not do it. It's not, we're not doing a sleep study through the night. we do, an evaluation while someone's fully awake, but we're still able to see brainwave patterns that are likely, if someone does have, for instance, sleep issues, we'll oftentimes see deficiencies in the slower brainwaves like delta and theta that prevent people from getting really deep restorative sleep.
So,
So this
so
is
the theta waves are on during the day, even when you're not sleeping?
So all you can think about the brain waves as like they're all being produced in some quantity at all times. It's more of like which is dominant. So during the day when we're alert and awake, beta waves for most people, that's our dominant brain wave. When we're getting into a sleep state, when we're lightly asleep, that state becomes predominantly theta waves. Then when we get into a really deep sleep, that state becomes predominantly delta waves.
Okay. So now you have this data, and how does that help a person to create new habits?
Yeah. So once we have all this information and we have kind of like what really they're wanting to improve, then we kind of have a roadmap of understanding which areas of the brain are working optimally. And we don't really need to focus on those other those areas. And then we also have an understanding of which specific areas are dysregulated and producing symptoms. So with that information, we can create really personalized protocols utilizing tools like neurofeedback. So neurofeedback, for people who have not heard of that about that yet, it is a form of biofeedback in which it is picking up those same brainwave signals that the brain map does. But unlike the brain map, which is just measuring, neurofeedback is actually allowing the brain to retrain and recalibrate to have healthier brainwave production. So, for instance, someone is hooked up to the electrodes. In this case, say they're doing it at home. They utilize our app, and they're basically playing these video games in which they're actually controlling one of the characters with their brain. So I know it sounds kind of wild, but basically we're training their brain to produce a certain state. And when their brain is producing that state, the character on the screen is going to run faster, the audio is going to get louder. So that's the positive feedback, basically through the principle of operant conditioning. We're providing the brain a reward when it's in that desired state and reinforcing that activity. Now,
So
when the
how does the
brain
person know how to produce that state?
Yeah, so that's kind of like where the neurofeedback is allowing them to understand when they're in the desired state. Because when they get into that state, they might not know exactly what they're doing consciously to produce that, but they're going to see the reward on the screen. So it's something that the more people do it, the more aware that they become about which state they're into and also kind of how to modify that. But it is largely kind of a subconscious process in the sense because neurofeedback is delivering, it's basically picking up the brainwave signals and giving feedback within 100 milliseconds.
Well, like, why would a person want to be in a certain state?
Mm-hmm. So, if someone's really needing to be in a focused state, they are needing to be highly productive, they have work to do, they need to be producing predominantly beta waves, really at those frontal lobes that are super important for executive functioning, decision making, focus. And if they're not producing that type of activity, say for instance, people with ADHD usually have an excess production of what are called theta waves, which we touched on earlier. They usually have an excess production of those slower, inattentive, kind of drowsy theta waves, which is preventing them from fully being able to focus, which is then leading to issues. And then you could take an opposite scenario, say at the end of the day, busy professional entrepreneur, comes home at the end of a day of, a lot of work. And if they're stuck in that beta state where they're still go, 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 then they're not going to have a very easy time kind of trying to relax and decompress and get deep restorative sleep at the end of the day. So being able to oscillate between these different brainwave patterns is really the sign of a healthy nervous system. You don't want to
So,
be always in one state or
hmm,
always in another.
okay.
It's about kind of being in whatever state is conducive to the activity at hand.
And you don't try to stimulate the state with an activity. You just let the person passively sit there, and the nonverbal response of the app alerts them to when they've created the state. Is that it?
I would say it's somewhat of an active process because there are other modalities that we utilize that are more of a completely passive entrainment process. Say, for instance, like binaural beats, which are these audio tracks that take people into a really, really relaxed, deep meditative state that's really activating the parasympathetic response. Now, something like that is just directly entraining the brain to produce those super slow waves. Whereas neurofeedback, people are more active participants. It's not all conscious, but they are kind of figuring out what on some level they're figuring out what they need to do to get the reward and do more of that activity. So I would say it's kind of semi passive.
So if I were, let's say, to count backwards by sevens,
Mm-hmm.
so that would trigger the beta waves.
Uh, in an ideal situation, if you're someone that doesn't have an issue with ADHD or trouble focusing too much, we would likely see, your beta would go up and your theta would go down. So beta and theta you can think of as kind of like the seesaw of like beta being like the accelerator, like the gas pedal of the brain, and then theta being like the inhibition, the brake pedal, slowing everything down. So if you're trying to focus, you're trying to count backwards by sevens. Ideally, the gas pedal, the beta wave should be elevating and the theta should be going down. But for people that have ADHD, they actually oftentimes will see an opposite pattern where the harder they try to concentrate, their brain, like it actually, the harder it is for them. So that's because they're not generating those healthy beta waves that are enabling them to be focused. Their brain is stuck producing those slower theta waves.
So would it be true that if you're producing the theta waves, then you don't succeed in actually doing the math? Is that it? And so anyone who actually is able to count backwards by seven, they are doing it by producing beta waves. Is that part of
It's not necessarily that cut and dry, I would say. Like you could still be doing the math, but maybe not as quickly, maybe not as accurately if you're not having that healthy beta wave response. It may be more of a struggle. It may take more mental energy. You might be more likely to get distracted and lose track of what you're counting. Not to say that if you're not producing beta, you can't be accurately counting. It's just how easy or difficult your brain is going to have at a time of doing that task, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So